it's Lynn, and today I'm coming at you with a book review on the novel that's been eating up every corner of my feed this year, Carol Claire Burke's debut, Yesteryear. It arrives already famous, already headed for a film adaptation, and I finished it wanting to talk to someone immediately. Natalie Heller Mills wakes at 4 in the morning before her kids and before the sun, so the version of her life she posts online looks effortless by the time anyone else is watching. She's a Harvard dropout turned tradwife influencer, married into the Mills political dynasty, running a farm called Yesteryear with her husband Caleb and their 6 children. A fantasy that nannies, farmhands, and a producer with an eye for flattering light quietly prop up off screen. Burke splits the book into 4 movements. The past arrives as a short, disorienting prologue, and the story lands in the present, where flashbacks fill in Natalie's strict Idaho childhood, her isolating first year at Harvard meeting Caleb, and a courtship that moved too fast to earn the name. Layered against that backstory is Natalie's empire in full operation, the branding and the perfect family performance, and the slow unraveling that Shannon, the young producer that Natalie hires to sharpen her content, largely drives once she sees far more of the ranch than Natalie intended to show. There's a marriage fraying in ways Natalie won't name out loud, backlash from critics she privately calls the angry women, and a daughter, Clementine, asking the kind of questions a camera can't edit around. Burke also surrounds Natalie with women who functions as her exact inverse. Clementine starts as the oldest daughter who won't smile correctly on command and grows into the one family member willing to look directly at what everyone else has agreed not to see. Shannon looks at first just like any other hire, but she's the one who turns her camera toward the farm workers and the conditions the family carefully keeps out of frame, and eventually pays for that attention personally and physically. Rena, the Harvard roommate Natalie spent years quietly pitying, ends up building something real and lasting, a career in journalism, while Natalie's own empire collapses the moment it meets the truth. And Abigail, her older sister, makes the choice that Natalie can't. When her marriage stops working, she simply ends it. And it's Abigail's home, eventually, that becomes the actual refuge in this story. Then there's the mother, Eliza, who I think is the most quietly devastating character in the book. For most of the novel, she reads as the source of Natalie's rigid ideology, the woman who raised her daughter on the doctrine that being kind matters way more than being honest, and who told everyone for decades that Natalie's father was simply no longer with them. It isn't until deep in the story that the truth surfaces. That reveal recontextualizes everything Eliza taught Natalie about womanhood and honesty. Mother to daughter, performance to performance. What happens after that, I leave alone almost entirely because the future section, as well as the epilogue, are where Burke does her cruelest work. And I don't want to rob you of the vertigo of realizing, right alongside Natalie, that nothing is quite what it first appears to be. Her old roommate Rena resurfaces here too, now a journalist, for a reunion that earlier chapters have been quietly building toward without you noticing. What I find most compelling about Yesteryear structurally is Burke's commitment to Natalie as an unreliable narrator. Not as a gimmick, but as an honest argument about how self-mythology works. Natalie insists her outward ideology came from God, from her husband, from circumstance, when the text keeps quietly proving time and time again that at every fork where she had any agency and choice, she was the one steering the wheel. By around page 2, I made a conscious choice about how to read this novel. Rather than argue over whether it functions as effective satire, I read this book instead as a character study, a portrait of a woman who chose a lane early and built an elaborate architecture of denial to convince herself it's the life she was born for, while something closer to real mental illness quietly consumes her underneath all of that performance. Once I read the novel that way, Natalie's behaviors stopped looking like a checklist of tradwife signifiers and started looking like symptoms of one central untreated wound. Her withdrawal from Caleb, her fixation on Rena, her contempt for Shannon, her hatred of the angry woman, her religious fervor, her desperate insistence on a perfect family. All of it is downstream of a woman trying to force her body and mind into a mold that never fit either one. Where some readers have found this repetitive, I found it cumulative in the way trauma actually behaves, circling the same wound from different angles rather than resolving it once. What the book seems to argue underneath all of it is that it doesn't much matter who the audience is. Eliza's own refrain that being kind is the only thing that ever really matters is itself a performance instruction dressed up as a virtue. Whether the audience is God, family, or millions of strangers watching a feed that never sleeps, the mechanism is the same. You build a self for other people to approve of. That's fine, even functional when life is easy, but the moment things get hard, a life you build entirely around being watched leaves you nowhere to put any of it because you've built every version of yourself for display rather than for the parts of life you're supposed to survive in private. Now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about Caleb, Natalie's husband, who also deserves more attention than he usually gets in conversations about this book. He's the man that his own family wrote off early, who wanted, of all things, to be a kindergarten teacher, and who instead fell into a version of masculinity that online validation and conspiracy forums built around him. I want to be direct here because I don't think it's a thread worth softening. There are points in the marriage where Caleb turns violent towards Natalie, including sexually, and nothing about his own disappointments or his susceptibility to online radicalization excuses that in the slightest. He's not a victim in the story, and the book doesn't let him off the hook for what he becomes. But he's also a case study in how easily whatever ideology is waiting online can absorb an aimless, unloved young man. And even by the book's final movement, he never actually manages to escape the escape that he built for himself. The novel's most sophisticated move arrives in the future section, where Burke finally cashes in an image she's been planting since the opening chapters. The hens that Natalie calls the ladies on camera, tended with performed warmth before the farm quietly slaughters them off screen. The hens stand in for Natalie herself, and for women in general, kept, curated, praised for their usefulness, and discarded the moment they stop performing correctly. It's a device that could feel heavy-handed in less careful hands, but Burke earns it. I also want to credit the sheer density of Burke's plotting. I struggle to understand the readers who describe this book as slow or boring because, in hindsight, almost nothing in it goes to waste. And this book will land differently depending on what a given reader brings into it, whether that's commentary on the tradwife movement, on religious fanaticism, or on surveillance culture and who's watching whom. I don't think any of those readings cancel each other out. That layered ambiguity is exactly what makes the book worth discussing at length. Now, let's talk about some of the pushback that this book has been getting. Critics have argued that Burke draws Natalie thinly, a paper doll onto whom she projects an argument rather than a fully realized inner self, and that the back half of the book is predictable. I understand where both readings come from, but I don't experience the reputation as flatness so much as obsession playing out on the page, and I didn't find the twists predictable at all. The book kept catching me off guard, and what I initially clocked as slower, more repetitive chapters revealed themselves on reflection to be groundwork Burke seeds carefully rather than filler. Other reviewers of the book have also pointed out that Natalie's religiosity stays frustratingly vague, that we never learn her denomination, and that Caleb and his father read more like mouthpieces for the ideology that the book wants to critique than fully rounded people. And I must agree, both are fair critiques, but I'd argue the vagueness fits a woman whose faith was always more performance than doctrine. And I'd point back to Caleb wanting to be a kindergarten teacher, a gentle, specific ambition that complicates the mouthpiece reading and suggests a person who existed before the ideology got to him. The book leaves a few threads dangling, and I still wonder what happened to some of the older kids from Natalie's influencer era life. And I wish a piece or two of the final interview had been filled in more completely, but that's just me. With that said, a novel this committed to withholding information earns the right to withhold a little at the very end, too. And I thoroughly enjoyed my time inside this unsettling story, which is exactly why I'm landing on 4 out of 5 stars. Yesteryear isn't a comfortable read, and it isn't trying to be one. It trusts you to sit with a difficult woman for 400 pages and find something worth examining in her anyway. And for me, that trust paid off. And so that leads me to you. Have you read this book yet, and or are you planning to? I'd love to know your thoughts, so leave them down on the comments section below. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You are awesome, stay awesome, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!